2, 1.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for attending our talk today about the access to justice barriers. Last year we presented the barriers framework, the research that led to its creation, and explained each of the barriers in a bit more depth, as well as how they're experienced by our users. It was a great session, and input from our audience helped us to refine and redefine some of these categories, and really helped us to further develop the framework. Some of the questions that we received were around how we'll reduce these barriers now that we have this insight into them. And that's what we'll be talking about today. But before we get into that, my colleague Shreya from User Research will give us a recap of what the barriers are. So Shreya, over to you.
Thanks, Gul. So what are the access to justice barriers? The access to justice barriers are based on several key pieces of research undertaken by the user research team in 2020, and they shed light on how users of HMCTS experience our services. The user research team conducted an analysis of internal research across all services, as well as analysing academic research in the justice space. And through that, key patterns started to emerge, which led to the beginning of the HMCTS barriers framework. I'll now briefly describe and list the 12 barriers that make up the framework. If you want to know more, feel free to watch last year's presentation, which explores this in much more detail. So, first of all, we have access to physical buildings and facilities. This can be a barrier if users need but cannot gain physical access to buildings and appropriate facilities within them. Second, access to tech. To participate in some HMCTS services, people will need access to appropriate and adequate technology. This could be a barrier if a user does not have access to devices, for example, or software, or if they lack a strong and reliable internet connection. Digital skills and confidence. So unfamiliarity with digital technology and the language of the internet, for example, words like URL, can be a barrier for some users. Fourth, support when required. Users may need to access all sorts of support to be able to participate in services to access justice. This support could be digital, emotional, or even legal support, and that support could be informal or formal support. It might be support to complete a specific task or a process, or support to navigate the legal system more generally. Fifth is emotional and mental resources. This can be a barrier when factors such as stress, anxiety, exhaustion, or trauma can impact somebody's mental state or capabilities in a specific moment, or it could affect somebody's ability to cope overall. Having trust in the system can also be a barrier. This could be due to previously negative experience someone has had in interactions with the government, or it could be due to perceptions that lead them not to trust the system from the outset. It could mean that somebody doesn't even start a process, or that they lose faith and drop out halfway through. Understanding what's happening. So understanding what's happening is key to effective participation in justice. However, we know that people don't always understand what's expected of them or what they need to do. So this barrier includes not being able to understand spoken or written information, not understanding complex legal processes, or even not being aware of support options available to you. Communicating effectively. So users need to be able to communicate effectively in order to participate in our services. So this could be a barrier for a number of reasons. For example, if the user has questions but doesn't have the confidence to speak up, if they struggle to communicate when they're upset or angry, or if they can't communicate well without visual cues or bodies language, just for example. Providing evidence and documentation. So this can be a barrier if somebody doesn't have the evidence or documentation required, for example, not having a valid form of ID, or for example, not having out-of-date documents. Space can be a barrier if users do not have access to appropriate spaces and facilities to participate. So, for example, a user might not have a fixed address or a safe or private or neutral space to participate from. This can be a significant barrier if users don't have adequate time to complete a task. For example, if they're completing an online form in one sitting and the form keeps timing out. Finance. So financial barriers can affect users in lots of different ways. For example, they might not have access to technology that has a cost or afford additional costs such as childcare, travel, or even money to buy data to participate in remote hearings. So now we'd like you to reflect back. Of the barriers that you've just heard about, which barriers do you think that users most frequently encounter? If you could write in the Q&A box, we'll review some of your answers at the end. I'll just go back quickly. So you can have a quick look. Brilliant. And I'll hand back over to Gul, who will talk you through our strategy for reducing those barriers.
Thanks, Shreya. So as you will have heard, the barriers are broad, expansive. They range from things that affect users' interaction all the way through to systemic issues. And so our strategy for reducing them has to be holistic as well. And that's what I'm going to talk you through just briefly before we get more into the nitty-gritty. So the first part of our strategy is to build awareness. So this is awareness of what the barriers are. We think everyone at HMCTS should be aware of what barriers are experienced by users and be able to talk about them with confidence. Building on awareness is understanding. So staff should be able to identify barriers within the services that they work in specifically, and be able to kind of create a shared understanding as a team, and hence plan how to reduce barriers within their services. Further to understanding is to build accountability. So as HMCTS, we need to hold ourselves accountable to reducing barriers. And in order to make sure that our standards of inclusivity remain high, we have to make sure that teams are demonstrating in a transparent way what they're doing to reduce barriers. And then lastly, measurement can help us to quantify and understand levels of barriers and services, where improvements need to be made, as well as track how well we're doing over time. Having this measurement will also help us to reinforce accountability as well as our understanding of the barriers as well. So in terms of how we're doing this, for awareness, we've developed an inclusion community where we share learnings and knowledge about different barriers. We also deliver regular presentations about the barriers within HMCTS to different teams to build that understanding of what the barriers are and create buy-in amongst staff of the framework. In terms of understanding, we've helped to facilitate workshops with different teams such as employment tribunals, private family law, as well as with specific teams like operations and business architecture and others. And we've developed a variety of different interactive tools and resources that give teams the opportunity to dig deeper into the barriers framework and identify those opportunities for improvement within their services. And we'll explain some of those tools and resources in a bit more depth shortly. For accountability, we've embedded the barriers into our service design manual. So this means that at every stage of a project's development, teams will have to demonstrate how they've considered the barriers and show what actions they've taken to reduce them. From everything starting from scoping documents to service blueprints and plans, our teams will have to consider the access to justice barriers. We're also working to update our design principles with our new insight and understanding of the barriers in order to make them more inclusion focused more generally. And again, teams are going to have to uphold these in their service design and delivery. And measurement of barriers is by no means straightforward. And in order to do it really thoroughly, there's a need for dedicated analysis resource, and this is something that we're looking into. However, at the start, we are adding questions around the barriers into our exit surveys to start getting some quantitative data to make sense of the prevalence of barriers across different services. We've also developed a barrier self-assessment guide, which helps teams to zoom in on what barriers could be being created within their services, and we'll show you a little glimpse of that later too. And of course, these tools will be supported by insights from user research and other data that we have, like complaints data, as well as data from our access to justice monitoring, which my colleague Laura will talk about shortly, not quite yet though. So those are, so that's kind of our strategy overall. And next, I want to talk a little bit more depth about the interactive tools and resources. So I'm going to talk through some, but not all, of the resources because there's too many to share today. But you can see here we've got the barrier summary cards, a set of personas, a quote bank, and then a series of activities. So first of all, we'll talk about the barrier summary cards. And these are designed to give a bite-sized introduction to each barrier. They can be used as part of workshop activities or as an introductory resource into the barriers framework. There's a much more comprehensive and detailed explanation of each barrier that's available as well, that gives examples and sources. But this is really our starting point that we use with teams to kind of whet their appetites on what barriers are. Next, we have the personas, and these are there to provide kind of a reliable and realistic representation of our service users and the barriers that they might experience. And what's interesting about these is that they show how the barriers intersect. We're not just focusing on one issue, but really trying to take a holistic perspective on people and the kinds of challenges that they might be facing. And the personas kind of provide a framework for building empathy with users of our service. And again, they can be used as part of different activities and to really keep users in mind while we're designing. Next is the quote bank, which is made up of a series of quotes from user research in HMCTS, as well as some of the other research that was used to create the barriers framework. And they really bring to life how these barriers are experienced by users on a personal level and the impact that they can have on people. And these, again, are a really helpful tool for building empathy, and we use them as part of workshops or to share during daily stand-ups, so we can keep users at the centre of our work, and they can even be used and have been used to kind of build personas that other teams are using. So we're really maximising the impact of the research that we have. And lastly, here's an example of one of the interactive activities that we have as part of our barriers activity toolkit. So there's a whole range of different activities which can help teams to recognise and identify the barriers in a service, to empathise with users and think holistically about their experiences and how our design decisions impact them. As well as some activities that help us to move forward from identifying problems towards fixing them. So yeah, this is just one example of many activities, and each activity has instructions with it to help teams get started. And we really welcome people to kind of chop and change and edit based on what they need and what stage they're at as a team. So we recognise that this work is part of a much bigger effort across the department to increase inclusion and access. And we're also working with our colleagues from Insight to measure access to justice. And Laura, our colleague who's here today, will briefly explain that work to us now. Over to you, Laura.
Thanks, Gul. So Gul and Shreya have talked through the research and strategy to reduce and design access to justice barriers out of the service. The Insight team, which I sit in, are now developing an approach to assess and monitor potential access to justice barriers in the reformed services, so we can identify ways to improve access to justice in our services. So to assess and monitor access to justice, we developed an assessment framework, and it incorporates the barriers mentioned earlier and is built on a definition that was initially developed by Natalie Byram and the Legal Education Foundation back in 2019. And this definition essentially consists of 4 elements, which are shown on screen now. So we've got access to the formal legal system, access to a fair and effective hearing, access to a decision, and access to a remedy. So the assessment approach looks to answer a series of access to justice questions relating to each of the elements, which you can see listed below the 4 elements on screen now. So I won't run through every single question here individually, but they're just shown here to give you a bit of a sense of all the different things we're trying to look at and to consider in the assessment as a whole. So the assessment involves collecting data and analysing evidence against all of these questions. And we draw on a range of evidence sources to help answer these questions. So the types of evidence that we draw on include things like the protected characteristics data, where that's available in reformed services. So that's things like gender and age, for example, and there was a specific session on that earlier. And we also try to draw on case management information that we hold, so channel, timeliness, representation, digital data. So that's data showing digital take-up, dropout rates, completion rates, and also courts and tribunals service centre data. So things like call volumes, perception surveys to get feedback from users as well as any other relevant external data. And that's just to name a few. There's lots of different sources. So a completed assessment identifies potential barriers that exist in the live service, recommends a service fix, and then sets out how we plan to monitor this once the service fix has been implemented. And we've actually piloted this approach in the probate service first. So where we've identified the access to justice barriers, tried to understand the cause of those barriers, and then started to implement fixes to try and address those. And once the fixes have been implemented, the final stage of that work will be to monitor the same access to justice data to see if the issues are being resolved or have been resolved rather. We're now scoping access to justice assessments for civil money claims, divorce, and the Social Security and Child Support Tribunal court service as well. And I'm now handing back to Gul, who has some questions for you.
Thanks, Laura. So on the topic of measurements, I wanted to share with you a snippet of the self-assessment tool, or the self-assessment guide, rather. And this is looking specifically at the barrier of emotional and mental resources. So just take a moment to reflect on this yourself. Have you ever used a service or maybe worked with someone who is using a service where any of the following things happened? You never started or delayed starting because it was overwhelming. You stopped midway because the process was hard to cope with. You avoided interacting, such as responding to letters or going to an appointment. You struggled to make decisions when you felt stressed. You didn't understand what was happening. You didn't feel clear on what you needed to do. You struggled to express or articulate yourself or didn't feel heard. So I'm not going to ask for answers to this directly, but if you want to talk about any of this during the Q&A, please feel free. But this just gives you an idea of some of the ways we help break down these really big, broad themes into smaller snippets that help us to kind of maybe target or pinpoint what might be going on for someone. All right, and we also have the results back on the ranking the barriers, and most of you, there was a real range of responses, but one of the key things that emerged was understanding what's happening as a barrier. And that's really interesting because that's quite consistent with a lot of the work we've done with services as well. And understanding what's happening comes up time and time again. So yeah, I think it's interesting that that's consistent across different services as well as within HMCTS. So thank you all for answering. All right. So I think that brings us towards the end of the presentation. Well, thank you so much for listening. I think we go to the Q&A now.
Thank you so much, Gul, Shreya and Laura. That was a really interesting presentation. I'm going to ask some of the questions that people have put so far into the Q&A, but please feel free to kind of add them if you can think of them now or following on from what the answer to these questions are. The first question I've got is for Gul. So I was just wondering why is HMCTS kind of doing this right now?
Well, the barriers to justice have been understood for a long time, and a lot of work's been done in this space. And so it's not the first time this is happening, but this is, I suppose, the first time we're bringing together these key understandings and themes into one usable framework for HMCTS. Some of the, I guess, trigger for this was a general shift in the design space from trying to design solutions for specific access needs or specific user needs towards trying to design services which are overall more accessible and inclusive for everyone, recognizing that there will always still be a need to cater to specific accessibility needs and specific user situation, but generally bringing the standard of inclusivity much higher and the barriers much lower makes the service easier for everybody and means you'll be doing less work to fix things for specific people, and everyone will have a better experience. So it's part of that general movement, as well as an effort to kind of create something usable and useful for HMCTS to really be able to put that knowledge into practice.
Thank you so much. It was a really interesting kind of point there about kind of the timeliness of this and, you know, the importance of putting it into practice. Laura, I've got a question for you which kind of follows on from that, I suppose, which is about measuring access to justice. I mean, you've touched on that. We've got a specific question here as well, which says, do you record the time when court users engage with the service, so weekends, office hours, etc., and what other data might help measure the digital reform impact on access to justice?
Yeah, thanks, Molly. So yes is the short answer. We do have a record of the time when court users engage in the service, and that's through Google Analytics data that we hold for each service. So when someone's completing that online, we know when they've done that. In terms of measuring impact on access to justice of the digital reform itself, that's actually something we're looking at the moment and considering with our MOJ colleagues who specialise in evaluation and are looking at the evaluation of the reform programme overall. So it's definitely something we're doing now. In terms of specific other data, I think we're going to draw on lots of different pieces of data to try and help answer that question. And it's a really timely question, actually, because something we're considering at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. And I guess kind of following from that, Shreya, somebody has asked how could they get involved if they wanted to share their experience. You got anything to say for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's great to see that this resonates so much with people and that there's appetite to give feedback, which we're always happy to receive. One way that people can get involved is if they're using digital services, there's an opportunity to complete an exit survey to give your feedback about your experience in that situation. Other than that, you can contact the PUE forums. They've been really pivotal in helping to critique the barriers framework and speak to experience of users, and they've been really good in sense checking and kind of looking at the barriers framework as it's been in development. So if you do have any feedback, we'd be really grateful to receive that.
Thank you so much. Now we've had a couple of questions coming in that are maybe looking for some kind of specific examples, which I think we probably can't answer. So there's one here which is asking about what considerations being made to increase the use of lay representatives, just as one example. So we can't get into the detail, but Gul, I wonder if you could tell me maybe about how projects are taking the barriers framework and kind of how it's being used in practice at the moment.
Thanks, Molly. Yeah, so the barriers framework in practice at the moment has been embedded into our service design manual and has been approved, the changes that we've added. So that means essentially from now, teams have to start considering the barriers from early on in their design of a service and throughout the development of that service, through all the major checkpoints. So all HMCCS services now have to take the barriers into consideration and demonstrate at the various stages what they're doing around barriers. So baseline, that's happening. And then beyond that, we're working with teams on a kind of team by team basis to go into more depth. And with some teams, we're taking more of a hands-on approach. With some teams, they're really leading the way. We've had workshops with specific teams on identifying barriers within their services. And then other teams, we've had more kind of capacity building, awareness building, and they've gone away and taken the barriers and materials and used them in their own ways, from building them into their personas to using them to map pain points within their service blueprints, to using them to frame some of their objectives for a project. So it's happening in really different ways across services, and we think that's important because each service team is the expert on what's going on within their area, whereas we have this broader understanding of the barriers in general. So where they're really adding them into the standards, making them accessible for people, creating the tools for people to be able to get to grips with it, and then measure them. And then what's happening within teams is happening kind of in a much more customized way across different services, if that helps at all.
It does, thank you so much. And I've got a follow-on question, which I don't know if you can answer, but it's asking when public family law will have the barriers introduced. So perhaps could you say something about, how we're reaching out to other services on this work?
We're working with a private family law team, and they're currently using this framework and have used it in a variety of different ways. I don't have a specific timeline for engaging with public family law directly, but as I mentioned, they are also equally accountable to demonstrating how they've kind of upheld the guidance within our service design manual, and will be equally accountable to upholding the new inclusive kind of aspects of the design principles that we work to.
Thanks, Gul. Shreya, I've got a question for you. We've had, and I have to say, we really welcome feedback on the tools and resources. So somebody has pointed out that one of the examples on one of our tools references hearing impairment, but not visual impairment, which is really useful, and we'll absolutely take that back and take it on board. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how do we iterate this? Like, is the barriers framework static? Like, are the tools static? How do we see that happening?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really good feedback to take forward. The barriers framework is by no means static. We're hoping for it to be almost a live resource that can be amended and iterated as we go forward. It's very much evidence-based. It's very much based on user experience. So the example on screen may have just referred to one specific person's impairment. It by no means tries to compare visual impairment to hearing impairment, for example. What we presented was just a very small snapshot of a very in-depth toolkit that we have. So yeah, I can absolutely see that in different slide decks or a different persona, for example, we'd be able to include a much wider range of user needs. Yeah, so they're not static at all, and the examples and personas change from project to project. We try and keep them really based on our users' experience, so it's not a fixed product in any way.
Yeah, and we do have some of our personas do have users with visual impairments as well. So just to mention.
Thanks, Gul. While we're talking to you, Gul, I've got another question, which again is quite specific, so you might want to talk in broader terms, but it's about unrepresented users who don't have legal capacity, just as an example, might not understand what information is or isn't relevant for their case. And the question is, how is legal capacity assessed so that service design can cater for it? And I'm not sure that that is specifically part of the barriers, but I think this point is kind of talking to kind of understanding information. Is there something you could, and that was actually one of the key barriers that people flagged up. I was wondering if you could say maybe something more about that barrier, about understanding information, and perhaps any examples of what you're doing about that with services.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, really interesting question. So I think one of the key things, one of the really key learnings about the barriers is that they are kind of, although we've got them in these categories, they don't neatly kind of line up, and the experience of one greatly can affect the experience of the others or exacerbate the intensity of the other barriers. So I think this one about understanding what's happening and support is a really good one, actually, because we know from our research that unrepresented users might have more difficulty in understanding what's happening. They might, for example, understanding a judgment or understanding how to engage with at different stages of the legal process. So yeah, I think that's a really good one to pick up. I mean, we had an example of somebody hiring a solicitor just to have kind of emotional support as well during the process, to someone to stand by their side and give them confidence. And I suppose what we're trying to do is really develop that understanding within teams around how experience of one type of barrier can really exacerbate other barriers. And so the things that we can do to alleviate a particular barrier, for example, understanding what's happening, could really affect the rest of somebody's experience as well. And I think the understanding what's happening barrier is a good one because it's some of these things, some of the causes or the underlying reasons are going to be systemic, and some of them are going to be very much within our control. So by improving our content, improving the design of our services, improving the support that we already have available, you know, we have a chance at really improving that for a lot of people. So yeah, I'm not sure that entirely answers the question, but I think it was a good one. And yeah, I'll leave it there because I'm rambling.
You've actually kind of touched on, I think, the next question coming out here, which I find really interesting, which is saying there's material coming from the US, which is suggesting that organizations are getting stuck in that awareness building stage or in that stage of collecting data, and that's just not translating into kind of on the ground change, and that there are some really simple and obvious things. And I feel like what you've just said there about trying to kind of tackle what we can tackle really talks to that. Is that the case? Is that the aim, that with kind of the service teams, that's what you're trying to do in terms of kind of just make small immediate changes? Is there something you could say about that?
Totally. Yeah, thanks for that question. Yes, I think that this is one of those spaces where some of these problems are really big and nebulous. You know, they're like wicked problems or wicked problems, however you prefer to pronounce that. So you can get stuck in endless conversations of like, well, this is because of the judicial system, or this is because of this historical thing, or, you know, we don't have leverage over that. So it's really important in our conversations and our work with teams to bring it back to what we do have leverage over and what we can action now, and recognizing that this is going to be long term. So it's not just about solving the quick fixes, but we have to think about what we can do in the short term, the medium term, and then more long term. And our strategy sort of reflects that in the awareness building as a core part, but we have all of these other layers of building and accountability and that measurement that can help us track how we're doing over time. So that measurement might tell us that we might reach a certain threshold by fixing those things that are maybe more within our remit to fix, and then we know if we plateau that there's more work that we can be doing, and we can start, thinking about those meatier things. So yeah, absolutely, it's long term, but it's important not to get stuck in that space of it's too big or too difficult.
Thank you so much. And following from that, Shreya, I've got there's a couple of points here which are really about kind of working with others. So I've got one question which is about how do we, and I don't know who put it out there, so if someone wanted to respond and say who you are, but how do we share our understanding of barriers in family cases? And I've got a second question which is around how are you working with kind of legal professionals, solicitors, barristers, advice centres? So I just wonder if you could say something about the engagement that's gone on so far to establish the framework, and then obviously for reform teams themselves, they'll have their own engagement networks. They should be working with people to understand the barriers in their own services. But for the framework, could you say something on the engagement?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of sharing understanding of barriers, one way would be to drop it in the Q&A chat now if you feel comfortable. Another way is to get in contact with the PUE forum via the event details, and they'll pass on any extra comments to us. We're always really keen for feedback. So thank you if you're willing to share. In terms of the engagement and what's gone into creating the barriers framework, it's, as I mentioned before, evidence-based and user-led. So in terms of users, it includes not just service users, but also professional users. I know that a lot of different sources went into creating the initial barriers framework. There was a lot of reports analysed in HMCTS. We also analysed a lot of academic work in the justice space. There was a lot of secondary research analysed to create that general barriers framework. It included research that was taking place during COVID, so it looked at remote hearings, and I know that specific work did also speak to professional users like barristers and people like that. Yeah, so we try and keep everything user focused and user centered to make sure that we get people's opinions, not just who are accessing the service, but also people who are delivering them, so that we make sure that the solutions work for both sides.
I've got another question for you that's just come in, which is asking if you need to consider a certain percentage for a barrier before you'd consider it as a barrier, or is one case enough? And I suppose that talks to kind of how much evidence do we need for us to add something into the barriers framework?
That's a really good question. I think because the barriers are so broad, I think a lot of people could consider that they face a specific barrier. I think there was a previous school of thinking which kind of focused on reasonable adjustments, and if you identify as X then you receive Y support, whereas there could be somebody who faces, for example, a temporary issue and a temporary barrier. So I think the answer is that one case is enough, but I think we would need to, I think we might need to take that away and kind of consider how we would progress that.
Perfect, thank you. And I know that the barriers work is also part of kind of a wider piece. Gul, could you tell us a bit about the wider work on barriers and how our barriers relate to that?
Yeah, so there's actually work going on across different government departments looking at barriers. So in the shift away from kind of fixes for users to a whole kind of systemic perspective on raising the bar for inclusivity. So HMRC has been doing their own work on it and have been really looking at the question of data and measuring barriers. There's been work in NHS on kind of testing the barriers within a health context and what they mean for users. And there's work being done kind of in GDS who are coordinating a cross-government barriers community and have their own set of 11 barriers. Our barriers really largely map onto the GDS barriers. Our research was done completely independently, but I think it's somewhat reassuring that they map on. The biggest difference is that HMCTS has this barrier of support, which isn't in the universal barriers, but I think that's quite unique to the service that we have, and that, you know, support and representation is such a key part of the justice experience. So there is a lot of work being done, and it's interesting because it means we can pool our resources. At the moment, we're at this stage where we've identified the barriers, and some departments have kind of some slight nuances on them. Some of them are just using the universal barriers created by GDS. And are testing things. So we're creating our set of resources and tools, which we've also shared with the cross-government community. And some of them are testing our tools as well, which is really exciting. And our tools were informed by tools created elsewhere. So it's kind of a real knowledge sharing space. Eventually, we'd like to get to a place where we can create kind of standards for inclusive design and patterns. So moving from here are the problems to here are some of the solutions that we have in a codified way that teams kind of pick up and use, like we have our service design manual. We're not there yet, but hopefully being part of this wider community will help us get there. And so that's that's really positive as a development.
Thanks, Cool. There's I think a really interesting suggestion here that's just come in, which is flagging that there's a bit of a disconnect with the regional HMCTS. So there's, with the tribunal user groups, this hasn't come up yet. I mean, it's very early days, isn't it? I think, is that something that you could take away and talk to colleagues in operations about, sharing that into that forum?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. We've had some engagements with colleagues in operations and done that awareness raising part of the strategy. And there is a lot of work to be done to build up from awareness, understanding to actually taking action. So yeah, I think that's a really good suggestion. And you know, we hope as time goes forward, we can engage more and more parts of HMCTS on this, and bring everyone into alignment on this kind of, the direction that we want to go in.
Perfect, thank you so much. We are almost out of time, and there's a couple of points that came in that I just wanted to quickly talk to. So one was saying at last year's event there was some conversation about easy read materials and what's happened. Have there been any developments? So the answer is yes. We've recently done some training within the content team and wider on the way that HMCTS should produce easy read materials. So that's certainly becoming more of a kind of standard, moving into the mainstream. And the second question we had is about equality impact assessments, and do we do that? And the answer is yes, we do. We've got a process for reform services that they have to follow through. So when we make any change at HMCTS, whether it's a big reform change or a smaller change within operations, we always have to consider the impact on people with protected characteristics. And if someone's interested in that, or something that isn't quite on the topic for today but is kind of related, then absolutely reach out to the PUE team, and colleagues will be more than happy to have a conversation around that. We've had, just kind of flying in at the last minute, a couple more questions, so I'll try and get through them really quickly. What are the solutions related to barriers in reform services? Okay, that is a huge question. That might be our next year when we come back and we can talk about. So if the first year was kind of the research that's led to the barriers, this is kind of how we're implementing it with reform services. I would really hope that, I don't know what colleagues think, but next year the team could come back and we could kind of demonstrate how this has really had an impact, and potentially Laura's team talking about, you know, there's evidence in the assessments. And we've got another final point, which I think we'll wrap up on, which is, have you investigated how special measures can adversely affect a defendant with a hearing impairment? I don't know if we have. Shreya, I'm going to ask you the question. If not, we'd absolutely love to hear more if that person would be happy to get in touch. Shreya, do you know if we have done that?
So we are working on a project looking at additional and complex needs, looking at how people request reasonable adjustments and special measures. I think that is quite a specific question, so I don't have the answer to that to hand at the moment, but I can definitely take that away and find out. Yeah, I think it would depend on which special measure is requested.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. So yeah, please do tell us more. And if anyone has any examples of barriers they've experienced or ideas of things that are working in their services or their experience that are kind of mitigating barriers, we'd also love to hear. The PUE email is the best place to reach out to us on, just so that we can kind of channel any kind of communication effectively. But thank you so much for listening today. We really appreciate it. And thanks to the panel for your time and answering all of those questions and such a good presentation. Thank you very much, everybody.